want to try to write my own pattern, but I don't know where to begin. Hi, it's Sonia here of The Pretty Stitch with today's episode of Yarn Matters. So you might have been crocheting or knitting for a while and you thought, you know what, I think I might want to try to start writing up some of my own patterns, which that's amazing. But you might not know where to begin. So today's video, we're going to go over some pattern writing tips and how to get started. And these are just tips and suggestions. I have been writing my own crochet patterns, and I do have written some knit patterns as well, but majority of my patterns are crochet for quite a while now. I think I started my pattern writing journey in either 2010 or 2011. I'll have to go back and check. Actually, I think it's 2010. My very first pattern I wrote, though, was in, I believe, 2005, and I sent it in to a publication. It was just a scrunchie pattern, and there used to be a publication called Hooked on Crochet magazine that I used to get for years. It was a cute little magazine. It was about that big. It was almost like a pamphlet size, but it had a lot of neat patterns in there, and I sent in one of my designs and they accepted it, and it was really a neat experience. And that would have been in 2005 or 6. I think it was before my youngest daughter was born, so that would definitely be in that time period. And then I was busy with 3 kids, and then I started writing patterns to sell on my own. I believe my first ones went out in 2010, and I have been writing patterns ever since. I write mostly crochet patterns, but I have ventured into knitting patterns, and I do write some Tunisian crochet patterns. So I have a little bit experience with pattern writing, and I thought today's video we would go over some tips and suggestions if you wanted to start your own pattern writing journey. So before you begin writing your first pattern, what I suggest is get familiar with how patterns look. So, and also, you want to make sure your skills are pretty good. I mean, you can still be a more beginner crocheter and knitter and write patterns. You don't have to be an expert stitcher to write a pattern. You really don't. There's different patterns for all different skill levels. So if you are a newer crocheter and you have got a lot of great ideas for more beginner type patterns, by all means write some beginner patterns. That would be amazing. There's definitely an audience for that. But before you dive into writing, if you want to be successful in your pattern writing journey, I suggest working existing patterns. Get familiar with how the pattern format is supposed to look. I would not just use any old pattern. Of course, you want to work a pattern that you enjoy. Let's say you really love making baby blankets, work a couple baby blanket patterns. And I would just suggest using patterns from designers that are a little bit more established in the business, because their patterns are going to be more on point as far as how they're supposed to look. So when you're starting out, you want to make sure that your patterns that you're writing are also on point and they're not a complete hot mess and confusing for the maker. I mean, when I was starting out, I used to get a lot of publications like that one I talked about, so I kind of used those as my guide as to how to write my patterns. And now I have my own formula that I use. I basically kind of just plug it in for each pattern that I write, like copy and paste, and then just go from there. Because I just have my own format of how I like my patterns to look. But I have worked with publications, and that has also helped me in kind of crafting how I like my patterns to look. But when you're working with a publication, of course you have to write the pattern how they want it. But when you're writing on your own, then you obviously can write your patterns how you like it. But there should be some fundamentals that are included in your pattern. So I do suggest, working a couple patterns, getting familiar with, about how a pattern should look, what it should include. So also you want to make sure that you know the stitch abbreviations. Most patterns use stitch abbreviations It's pretty standard. It'd be really hard, not that it's really hard, but you don't want your pattern to be like pages and pages and pages and pages and pages long. Like that can just get a little crazy. So if you're just writing your pattern in just plain regular English or whatever language that you're using, it can make for a really long pattern, and that's not always necessary. So that's why we have stitch abbreviations. So if you're a little shaky on your stitch abbreviations, I would just kind of get more familiar with them. You don't have to know all of them if you're just starting out writing patterns. It's okay, but you should have a little bit of knowledge of your stitch abbreviations. Also, some patterns do use charts, and charts can be really necessary with certain patterns. Let's say you want to make a pattern with a whole bunch of color work, like basically pictures with yarn, then a chart would be really important to use. Also, some patterns, like if you're newer at writing patterns, your first pattern's probably not gonna be this ornate lace project, but a lot of lace patterns, a chart might be helpful for that. So if you've never worked with a chart, don't know what a chart's supposed to look like, I would, look at some patterns. So yeah, some patterns, a chart would be really helpful, and you don't have to go crazy with the chart thing. I think sometimes people get a little intimidated with that. I make most of my charts using Excel. They're also, if I have to make like a stitch chart, I used to actually draw them out, like the symbols, but now we have programs out there that we can use. There was one called Stitch Fiddle that used to be free. I'm not sure if it's free. I will check and see if it's free and let you know, because I used to use that, but I haven't used Stitch Fiddle in a couple of years because I actually haven't written a pattern that needed a chart in a couple of years. But I actually have one that I want to write that I might need to use a chart. So I will check and see if Stitch Fiddle is free, but that is something that you might want to use. There are some other programs out there that can help you write charts, but if you're just starting out, you don't need to go out and spend a lot of money. I mean, when I started, I just used my computer, pencil, paper, and went from there pretty much. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of some tips that I have to help you get started, to get from your idea to the actual written pattern. So tip number one, you need an idea. You need an idea of what you want to write about, what you want to make. That's pretty much the key thing there. So a lot of my ideas, I just come up with an idea. Let's say I just put a pattern out, a hat pattern, and I had this idea. And so a lot of times, especially when I first started out, I made a prototype because I wanted to make sure that the idea I had in my head could actually be translated into yarn. So that might be something that you want to do. Now a lot of times I have an idea, because I've been doing this a while, I can do this, and I just kind of stitch it out and write it out at the same time. But when I first started out, I didn't do that. I actually would make it first to see if it actually could be made, and then I would make another one and write it all out and do it like that. And I used to start writing it out with pencil and paper. I would hand write all my patterns, which I can't believe I used to do that. But I didn't have a laptop. We had like a family computer, and so I couldn't just sit in the chair and hog up the computer the whole time and type it out. So I would have to hand write my patterns, and then once it was written out, then I would go later and type it out on a computer. But now I have a laptop, which is nice, and so I just I don't really use pencil and paper anymore. I just type it out as I'm going. So you have this idea. So what you want to do next is you make the prototype, but you also want to make sure that you are not copying somebody else's work. That's really important. You don't want to be stealing somebody else's idea. Now, that doesn't mean, like, let's say you want to make a bucket hat. There are so many bucket hat patterns out there, and that's fine. So don't think, oh, somebody else made a bucket hat, I can't make a bucket hat pattern. No, that's not really what that means. You can put your own spin on a bucket hat, and it will be your own pattern. But you just want to make sure that when you are making your item and designing your item, that it is an original design. So you don't want to use the same colors as somebody else, the same amount of stitches as somebody else. Now, of course, because I always feel like there's nothing new under the sun, you know, you can't reinvent the wheel. Chances are something that you make or design, somebody else has probably already done it. So sometimes there is a little bit of unintentional copying, and I think that's what a lot of it is, but sometimes there is downright copying. So just, you know, be careful. You know, you could look on Google and just see, you know, bucket hat patterns, or on Etsy or Ravelry or whatever, and just see that, make sure that your idea is not exactly like somebody else's. So I wouldn't get too bogged down on that and stressed out about it, but you know, just keep it in mind. So you have your idea, you work the prototype, now let's start writing. So I find with a good pattern, when you are writing your pattern, is you should have a cover page. I find that to be really nice. I didn't always include a cover page. I kind of would just have a little bit and just boom, get right into the pattern. But now all of my patterns that I write, even if they're super duper simple, like a coaster or whatever, I always have a cover page. So what should be on that cover page? Obviously the name of the pattern should be on there. So I highlighted 2 patterns that I had written. So one of them was Mima's Stars. That's the name of my pattern. And then after that, I always include about this pattern. I just find it to be nice. I just have a little thing on there that's like the inspiration for the pattern, which Mima's Stars was my mom, who's called Mima. Or just explaining what the pattern is, you know, oh, this is a hat, and it, whatever, it's made using cluster stitches or whatever it is. Just something short and small is nice. Then I also like to include with my patterns, and this is optional, not all pattern designers do this, but I think it's really nice to include it, is a level. So if it's a knit pattern, I would have knit level. If it's a crochet pattern, crochet level. So is it a beginner pattern? My level system is usually beginner, advanced, beginner, intermediate, or advanced is the level system that I have come up with. So I find that a level should be, is a nice thing to include on the title page. Obviously you also want to have a picture of the item that, you know, you want the person to make. I have seen patterns that don't have pictures, which I find in this day and age to be really odd, but occasionally it happens. Now sometimes there's mystery alongs where, you know, the designer doesn't want the person to know, they kind of have to guess. But if it's just a regular pattern that you want to sell or even have for free, have a picture of it. So after you have your picture, also on your title page, you want to have what I say materials needed. You could say something else like what do I need to make this, whatever. I just always include, I just say materials needed. And then underneath I have, if it's a crochet pattern, the hook. What hook size does the person need to have? I have the yarn, the type of yarn. I usually have in the notes, I'll put notes underneath the yarn, and I will say, so what I usually do with the yarn on my patterns is I'll have underneath yarn notes. And in those notes I'll include maybe some yarn suggestions, or I'll include the type of yarn I used in the picture. And then after, you know, the yarn and the hook, and also when you're with the yarn, you do want to put a yardage amount of how much the person would need. That's important. So let's say they're making a blanket. Well, obviously that's going to require a bit of yardage. So, you know, you might want to say it needs 900 yards or whatever that is. It's just, I usually do an estimate with the yardage because I would rather have the person have a little bit left over than not enough, because that's really annoying. And then also with materials needed, include obviously a yarn needle, because even if there's no sewing involved in the pattern, ends need to be woven in. I don't care what kind of pattern it is. You're going to have an end and it will need to be weaved in at the end. So I always include yarn needle if you're making like a clothing item and it uses buttons, or if there's something like a hat and you included a pom-pom in the picture, then I also include in the materials that, you know, pom-pom is optional, or some other type of embellishment. But if you're making a sweater that uses buttons, definitely have buttons, how many buttons that the person would need, and also the size of the button too, because you don't want them to buy buttons that are too small, otherwise it's not going to work, or buttons that are too large. So after you've got the materials needed, then also include gauge if gauge is important. Some patterns gauge is not that important, but other patterns, gauge is important. So I would have your gauge on there, and also I do include with some of my patterns finished measurements. So let's say the person is making a scarf, and you want to know how long the scarf is supposed to be. Also, if you're making clothing items, then you might want to have a schematic on there of how for bust sizes, shoulder, like that. Include some type of measurement on there that can be helpful for the person that is making your pattern. So what I also include on my cover page is I just have my name on there, and I have a copyright on there because I don't want someone else taking my work and trying to pass it off as theirs. And then I also like to have on my cover page is stitch abbreviations. I think that is really helpful and really important on a good pattern, is to have stitch abbreviations. Even if the pattern that you have written is for an advanced stitcher, obviously they would probably know the stitch abbreviations, but it's just a helpful thing for the person to look on that cover page and be like, oh, what stitches are used in this pattern, and then they're right there and you can see. Now you don't have to write every stitch abbreviation. Like, I only put the stitches that are used in that pattern. So I have like a little text box, and mine will say stitch abbreviations used in this pattern. And then the last thing on the cover page, and then this would be for the rest of the pattern, is page numbers. I didn't start out putting page numbers on my patterns, but I had a couple people say, hey, it would be really nice to have page numbers, because if they print it out and they lose or it gets out of order, they know what order the pattern's supposed to be in. So what I do now is, and this is just my formula, you can come up with your own formula. I like my page numbers on the bottom, in the middle, and I always have the title of the pattern and then the page number. Okay, so we've got our title page good to go. So after that, the next page 2 is the directions. You want to get into making the pattern. So I always put at the top of that first page with the directions, I put directions. And it depends on, like, some patterns, I like to write a lot of patterns for dolls, for doll clothes, and I often write sets. So I'll say directions for dress, and then I'll have all the dress directions, and then if there are shoes, I'll be like directions for shoes, so that the person just knows that now they're in the shoe section. So yeah, you want to have your directions, and you want to be careful when you're getting into your directions. So when you're getting into the directions part of your pattern, it's important to know your audience. So know who you're writing the pattern for. So if you're writing a pattern for a beginner, then you might want to have a little bit more information on there. If you're writing a pattern, let's say more for an intermediate stitcher or an advanced, you might not want to be as wordy, because that's going to get a little tedious for that person, because they've been around the block, they know the abbreviations, they don't need like super detailed explanations on how to do things. So it's just important to know your audience. I tend to be I really want the person that's making my pattern to be successful, so I tend to be a little bit wordier, and you can probably figure that out because in my videos I can be a little detailed with things, and that's just me. I really want to help the person that is making my pattern to be successful, so I tend to be a little wordier at times, and I've had people tell me that it's too wordy. You can't make everybody happy, but know your audience, and I will even warn people in some of the patterns and just say, hey, this is a little bit detailed because it's geared for beginners. It is what it is, and some people just like to complain, so you can't make everybody happy. But yeah, know your audience, and then, write in a more, and then write your pattern. I think it's important, if you're using rows, write row 1, row 2. If you're using rounds, round 1, round 2. and then go from there. And I like to write my patterns in a more traditional way. And if you would see it in a publication, that's kind of how I tend to write my patterns. So also in your directions, I think it's really important to include stitch count. Some patterns do not include stitch count, and I don't include stitch count on every pattern. And if I do not, I usually say it doesn't matter, because some people, they get really hung up on that and they're like, oh, do I have the right amount of stitches? I don't know. So I try to put stitch count on almost all of my patterns unless it's not necessary, and I'll just tell them stitch count doesn't matter. And then that kind of like takes the heat off you and then helps the maker be like, oh, I can relax. It doesn't matter how many stitches are on there. Or if you're doing a technique in your pattern that you think, oh, it might be a little bit tricky, or the user might not quite understand, or you're having a hard time explaining it, pictures are really helpful. Or like I do videos on YouTube, so sometimes I'll include links in my pattern that the person can click on to demonstrate a certain technique. So again, I want the user of my pattern to be successful, so I try to include as many tools as I can so that they can be successful when making my pattern. So before YouTube, I did a lot of pictures of like how-to steps, because sometimes when you're just seeing it written, you're like, I don't understand this. But then when you see a picture or you see a video, you're like, oh, that makes complete sense. So you might want to include that in your pattern. So then after you have all the directions written out, I always like to include a finishing section. So after the directions are done, I always say finishing. And usually I'll just say weave in all your loose ends. I mean, that should be a given, but you know, just a little reminder for the person to be like, hey, you need to weave in those loose ends. And then I most always suggest blocking. And some patterns, you know, blocking's kind of required. People don't always know what blocking is. So let's say you designed a lace shawl. They almost always need to be blocked. So you don't want that user to come back to you and be like, oh, my shawl did not look like yours. You know, you wrote a terrible pattern. Well, if they didn't block it, well, yeah. So I usually say weave in all your loose ends. Blocking is highly recommended, or block your item if necessary, something like that, just to kind of put it in that user's mind like, oh, I might need to block this item so that mine, you know, looks like the designer's. And then with finishing, just add any extra tips that, you know, feel need to be included. Let's say if buttons need to be sewn on, if a pom-pom needs to be sewn on, you know, anything like that, just include that in the finishing. So your pattern's now written. Now what? So you think, okay, I'm good to go. I'm ready. Let's get this out in the wild, and you know, so I can sell it and have people make my item. Well, not so fast. After you've written your pattern, I highly suggest either getting it tech edited or tested. So if you're brand new to pattern writing, you'd be like, what the heck is a tech editor? So let me tell you what a tech editor is. So a tech editor is somebody that is trained, and they're going to read through your pattern and they're going to look through it, pick out any grammatical errors, typos, if something sounds weird or if it's too wordy. They'll check. A lot of times with crochet and knitting, there's a little bit of math involved, so they might see if the math adds up, and then just kind of really help your pattern look spit and polished, basically. Now, tech editing, you usually have to pay somebody to do that. I personally don't use tech editors. Now, I have had some of my patterns tech edited, and that's usually with a publication that I've done that with. So I have worked with some great tech editors, but I feel like I've written enough patterns, worked with tech editors, that I don't want to say I don't need them, but I don't need them, I guess, if that makes sense. So you tech editors out there, don't come after me. But if you're really struggling with your pattern, a tech editor might be helpful, and there are lots of tech editors. You can go on Ravelry, and you can, you know, look around on the forums. There's a designer forum on there, a designer forum, I belong to that one, and you could even just say, hey, any tech editors interested in working with me? Or there might be some people that have advertised for their services, so you might be able to find one on Facebook, whatever. But again, I personally don't use tech editors. I prefer testing. There's a big debate of tech editing versus testing, and I think both of them are great, but personally I think testing is more important to personally. Now, I do find with tech editing, it works better with knitting. I often feel tech editing doesn't always work as well with crocheting. And the reason being is crocheting is a little more fluid. It probably makes no sense to you, but knitting is very like straightforward, where crocheting can be kind of all over the place. So tech editing doesn't always necessarily work. Like I've had some patterns tech edited and they were crochet patterns, and then when I went over them I was like, they cut out some key information, so the tech editor thought, oh, she's being too wordy, I'm going to edit this out, but actually it was really necessary information that they cut out. So that's why I find with crochet patterns it doesn't always work with the tech editing, and I prefer testing. So you're probably wondering, where can I get my pattern tested? Well, I get my patterns tested on Ravelry. I've also used Facebook. I don't like Facebook as much for testers. I might try it again. I had some bad experiences on there, but I'm sure there's some amazing testers on Facebook. So if you are going to get your pattern tested, and the reason being is when you're writing a pattern, and with anything, you might have proofread that thing and made prototypes, but the way our brains work, and especially when it's our own work, sometimes we just miss mistakes. And it's just really good to have a second set of eyes and somebody that's not emotionally attached to what you just wrote, and they can just look at it on a fresh set of eyes, fresh set of hooks and yarn, and try to make it. And I just find that to be really helpful, because they might pick out some mistakes that you were like, mistakes? What mistakes? There's no mistakes in there. And sure enough, there's a crazy typo, or you missed a key section, that's important in making the item. So I find testing to be important. And again, Facebook, Ravelry. So that is all that I have as far as pattern writing. Just get in there and get started. You don't have to be super elaborate. If you just want to make something small like a coaster, go for it, but my dog is like, you have filmed long enough. So I'm going to end this video here. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like and subscribe. And if you didn't, just scroll on by, and I will see you next time. Bye!